There's a specific kind of failure that only shows up in organizations that are actually trying hard, run by leaders who genuinely care about getting things right. It happens when every decision, no matter how small, has to travel back up to the top before anyone's allowed to act on it. The leader isn't lazy or careless. If anything, they're too careful, and the whole operation slows to the speed of one person's attention, which is never fast enough once real conditions get complicated. Extreme ownership calls the fixed decentralized command, and the idea comes from watching that exact bottleneck nearly get people killed in situations moving far too fast for any single person to approve every call. The solution wasn't finding a smarter, faster leader. It was pushing real decision-making authority down to the smallest possible unit, junior leaders, individual operators, people close enough to the actual situation to see it clearly and act without waiting for permission that couldn't arrive in time to matter. That only works if those junior leaders genuinely understand the overall intent behind the mission, the actual why, deeply enough to make good calls on their own, in situations the plan never explicitly covered. I want to spend this whole episode on that idea, because on the surface it seems like the principle least relevant to something you do completely alone. There's no chain of command here, no junior leaders to delegate to. It took me a while to see that decentralization still applies. Just relocated from a hierarchy of people to a hierarchy of moments inside one person, the well-rested version making the plan, and the exhausted, cold, 5 in the morning version who actually has to execute it in real conditions the plan never quite anticipated. It's worth naming why this chapter felt like an unlikely fit at first, more than any other in this series. Every previous idea still assumes one continuous person making decisions across a single timeline. Decentralized command assumes something closer to two different decision makers, separated not by different people, but by different conditions, planning in comfort versus executing under fatigue. Once I saw those as two distinct roles rather than one continuous self, a lot of my past failures started looking less like willpower problems and more like a communication failure between two versions of the same person who'd never actually been properly introduced. Here's the mistake I made, the mirror image of the micromanaging leader this chapter describes. For a long stretch, every meaningful decision about a given run got made in advance the night before by the calm, rested version of me, sitting at a desk with a coffee. Pace targets down to specific numbers. Exact routes, precise fueling timing. Nothing was left for the actual runner, the tired, half-awake person standing at the door in the dark, to decide on their own. That version of me was treated less like someone capable of good judgment, and more like a soldier expected to follow orders exactly, with zero authority to adapt when reality inevitably diverged from the plan. The problem wasn't that the plans were bad. It was that the 5 in the morning version of me had never been trusted with real authority to adjust anything, which meant the moment conditions didn't match the plan exactly. That version had no framework for making a good call, only the choice between rigid compliance with a plan that no longer fit or total abandonment of the whole run. Asterisk, every mismatch between the plan and reality became a crisis rather than a minor adjustment, because nothing in between rigid obedience and total collapse had ever been authorized. I remember the specific morning this became impossible to ignore. The plan, written the night before by the well-rested version of me, called for a specific tempo effort, a particular route, a particular pace. That morning arrived with genuinely different conditions than expected, colder than forecast, legs stiffer than usual from an unrelated errand the day before. The desk planner version of me had never given the door version any authority to adjust the plan on the fly, only to execute it as written or not run at all. So that's exactly what happened. Faced with a plan that no longer fit and zero authorization to modify it, the 5 in the morning version did the only thing that felt available. Skipped the run entirely, rather than doing a slower, shorter, perfectly reasonable version that the actual conditions called for. What made that particular morning so instructive, in hindsight, wasn't the missed run itself. It was noticing afterward that skipping entirely had actually felt like the more disciplined choice in the moment, not a failure of discipline at all. The plan said tempo effort at a specific pace. Anything else felt like cheating on the plan rather than adapting it, because no version of adapting the plan had ever been explicitly authorized. Rigid compliance and total abandonment were the only two options that felt legitimate. And when the first one became physically unreasonable given stiff legs and unexpected cold, the second one filled the entire remaining space by default. That's decentralized command failing in exactly the shape the book describes, just with only one person playing both roles. Headquarters had planned brilliantly and communicated nothing except the plan itself. The field, meaning the actual runner and actual conditions, had no authority to adapt, and a rigid plan meeting an unplanned reality with zero delegated judgment produces exactly one outcome: paralysis, followed by total failure rather than partial success. The fix, once I understood what was actually missing, wasn't a better plan. It was giving the field version of myself, something the book insists on for any decentralized system to work at all: a clear understanding of intent, the actual why behind a given day's training, deep enough that adjustments could be made on the fly, without needing to check back with the planner who wasn't there anyway. Instead of a rigid pace target, the plan started carrying its underlying purpose alongside it. Not just run this pace for this distance, but this session exists to build aerobic base. So the actual goal is sustained effort in a moderate zone, whatever pace that translates to given today's conditions. That single addition changed everything about what the 5 in the morning version was authorized to do. A cold, stiff morning wasn't a crisis anymore. It was simply new information, folded into a decision the field version now had real authority to make, because the underlying intent, not just the specific numbers, had actually been communicated. It's worth noticing how small that change actually was on paper, one added sentence, and how disproportionate the effect turned out to be. Nothing about the training itself got easier. What changed was entirely about authority, about who was allowed to make which decisions and on what basis. And that mattered far more than any adjustment to the training content itself. I want to walk through a few different places this shows up, because decentralized command ends up applying to more than just pace decisions on a cold morning. The first is exactly that in-the-moment adaptation, and it's worth being specific about what changed mechanically rather than just philosophically. A plan built around explained intent instead of rigid instructions gives the tired, distracted, under-resourced version of you real decision-making room. Instead of a binary choice between perfect execution and total failure, there's a whole middle ground available, because the field version actually understands what the session was for and can improvise toward that purpose using whatever the day actually offers. This is the same idea from a couple episodes back about explained orders surviving fatigue better than unexplained ones, pushed one level further. It's not just that explained orders get followed better, it's that they authorize real judgment in situations the original order never anticipated. I've noticed the same middle ground open up well beyond pace and distance. A stated purpose behind a strength session, built to support the joints rather than to hit a specific number of repetitions, means a tired evening can still produce a shorter, gentler version that honestly serves the purpose instead of an all-or-nothing choice. The specific numbers were never really the point. They were a stand-in for a purpose that, once made explicit, turns out to tolerate a lot more flexibility than the rigid version ever suggested it could. A second version of this applies to habits themselves, the ones that have become genuinely automatic rather than requiring active decision-making every time. This is, in a strange way, the most literal form of decentralization available to one person. A habit that's been trained deeply enough operates almost like a trusted subordinate, executing a well-understood intent without needing conscious oversight for every step. tying the shoes, filling the water bottle, the first quarter mile of a familiar route, none of that gets actively decided anymore. It just happens, freeing whatever limited conscious attention exists at 5 in the morning for the parts of the day that actually need real judgment. Trying to consciously micromanage every single piece of a morning, rather than letting well-trained pieces run on their own authority, is the same bottleneck the book describes in an organization that never delegates anything, just relocated into one person's own morning. There's a specific contrast worth drawing here, because it explains why some mornings feel effortless and others feel like wading through mud despite objectively similar conditions. On a morning where the early steps are fully decentralized, running on trained habit rather than active decision, the limited willpower available gets spent entirely on the one genuine decision that matters, whether to keep going once the legs start complaining partway through. On a morning where every single step from the alarm to the shoes to the door to the first quarter mile still requires active, conscious decision-making because none of it has been trained into automatic execution yet. That same limited willpower gets spent 5 or 6 times before the run has even properly started, leaving almost nothing in reserve for the moment it's actually needed most. Building genuine habits isn't just about consistency for its own sake. It's about deliberately decentralizing the early, low-stakes decisions so full attention remains available for the ones that actually require it. A third version, and the one that surprised me most, involves the audience this channel has slowly built. For a long time, I treated every question or comment as something requiring a direct, personal response, as if genuine support for someone else's running only counted if it came through me specifically. What actually started happening once the channel built up enough of a shared understanding of the actual intent behind all of this, ownership, honesty about bad weeks, showing up regardless of motivation, was that people started responding to each other in the comments with exactly that same understanding without me needing to be the one delivering every time. That's Decentralized Command 2, just at the scale of a small community rather than a military unit. It only worked because the underlying intent had actually been communicated clearly and repeatedly enough across enough episodes that people could apply it themselves, in their own words, to someone else's specific situation without needing to wait for me to personally weigh in. There's a specific exchange I noticed a while back that made this concrete rather than theoretical. Someone had posted about a rough week, a missed streak, the familiar shape of a setback this series has covered a few times now. The response that actually helped them, the one that seemed to land, didn't come from me. It came from someone else who'd clearly absorbed the same core idea from a much earlier episode. The difference between a gap treated as data versus a gap treated as a verdict, and offered it back in their own words, shaped around the specific situation in front of them. I hadn't written that response and couldn't have. Not because I lacked the words, but because I wasn't the right person in that specific moment to deliver them. The intent had been decentralized successfully enough that someone else, closer to the actual situation, could execute better than headquarters ever could have from a distance. There's a boundary worth being precise about here, the same as every chapter in this series is needed. Decentralized command is not the same as abandoning leadership altogether, and it's easy to misread it that way, especially applied to something as solitary as running alone in a forest. The whole system depends entirely on intent actually being communicated clearly first. A junior leader given real authority, but no understanding of the underlying mission isn't decentralized command. It's just confusion with extra steps. The 5 in the morning version of me can only make good calls on a cold, stiff morning because the underlying purpose was actually explained in advance, not because the plans simply got vague or absent. Removing the rigid pace target without replacing it with a clear enough sense of purpose wouldn't have produced good judgment. It would have produced exactly the kind of aimless, unstructured wandering that gives just listen to your body a bad reputation among people who've tried it without ever actually building the underlying clarity that makes it work. This distinction matters enormously because just trust yourself, don't overplan, and genuine decentralized command sounds similar from a distance, but are almost opposites in practice. The first is an absence of structure, dressed up as freedom. The second is a very specific, very deliberate kind of structure, one built around communicating purpose so thoroughly that the structure barely needs to specify anything else. Decentralization isn't the removal of leadership. It's leadership that's done its job so well in advance, explaining the why clearly enough that it no longer needs to specify the how in exhausting detail every single time. There's a specific test worth having ready for telling real decentralization apart from that kind of accidental abdication. Real decentralization can explain, after the fact, why a given adjustment made sense in terms of the original intent, even if the specific action wasn't planned in advance. A cold morning shortened to an easy jog instead of a tempo effort still served the underlying purpose of consistent aerobic development, just adjusted for conditions. Accidental abdication can't explain itself that way. It's just whatever felt easiest in the moment, dressed up afterward in the language of flexibility. If you can trace an adjustment back to the actual why, and it still holds up, that's decentralized judgment. If the only justification is that it felt right at the time, with no connection to any underlying purpose, that's probably just the old excuse machine from episode 1, wearing a more sophisticated costume borrowed from a much later chapter. So here's what this looks like as a practice, kept to one thing rather than scattered across several, the same as every episode in this series. Take whatever training plan or morning structure you're currently working from, and check whether it's communicating intent or just issuing instructions. If a session simply says a specific pace, a specific distance, with no stated purpose behind either number, that's an instruction, not delegated authority, and it'll break the same way mine did the first time conditions don't cooperate. Rewrite it even briefly to carry its actual why alongside the specifics. This session exists to build endurance, to practice a faster gear, to simply maintain consistency during a hard week. Once the why is attached, the tired, distracted version of you executing it tomorrow has real room to adapt intelligently, rather than only the choice between rigid compliance and total collapse. I want to be specific about what this rewriting actually looks like because the instruction alone can stay abstract without a worked example. A plan that used to read simply 6 miles, easy pace, becomes something closer to 6 miles, easy pace. Purpose is recovery and aerobic maintenance after a harder effort 2 days ago. The second version gives the 5 in the morning version of you something to actually reason with if 6 miles turns out to be unrealistic that day. For miles at the same easy effort still serves the stated purpose. A rigid 6-mile target with no stated purpose gives no such room. It's either 6 miles or the whole thing feels like failure. I'll add one specific habit that's helped make this concrete rather than abstract. Before finalizing any plan the night before, I ask one question out loud. If tomorrow's conditions turn out completely different than expected, does this plan give me anything to work with, or does it just break? If the honest answer is that it just breaks, the plan gets one more line added, the actual purpose behind it, specific enough that a reasonable adjustment becomes obvious rather than requiring permission that won't be available at 5 in the morning. There's a broader version of this same question worth asking, not just about a single day's plan, but about any instruction you find yourself giving other areas of your life too, whether that's a household routine, a work habit, or an expectation you've set for people around you. Anywhere a rigid instruction exists without an attached reason, the same fragility is probably waiting there too, just not yet tested by the specific unexpected morning that would expose it. Tomorrow morning, whatever plan exists on paper is going to meet a version of you that's tired, distracted, and dealing with conditions the plan never quite anticipated. That version doesn't need a more detailed set of instructions to follow exactly. It needs to actually understand why the plan exists in the first place. deeply enough to make a good call when reality, as it always eventually does, diverges from what got written down the night before. There's a thread worth naming that connects this idea back to nearly everything covered so far in this series. Ownership only works if the person executing actually has room to act, not just to comply. Belief only survives if the reasoning behind it has genuinely been internalized rather than borrowed. Even the earlier chapters about ego and simplicity assumed a person capable of real judgment, not just obedience to a fixed plan. Decentralized command is really the mechanism that makes all of that possible in practice. Trusting the version of yourself who actually has to execute in real conditions, with real judgment, rather than treating every deviation from a plan as a failure of will instead of what it usually is, an entirely reasonable adjustment made by someone who understood the mission well enough to adapt it. I'll see you on the trail tomorrow. Same time, same choice. This is Run to Evolve. One day, one run, one lesson, no excuses.